Welcome, geometry students. Today we're going to learn more about the target that states classify and find measures of angles formed by parallel lines and a transversal. In the previous video of this target, we learned about four important angle relationships. We learned about corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles, and consecutive interior angles. If you're unsure about any of those four terms, please take a moment to pause the video and look back at your previous night's notes. And if you need further help understanding those, please do come see me. So let's take a look at what's true about these different angle relationships. All of these angles are created by two lines and a transversal, so three total lines. So what we're learning about today is if the two lines that are intersected by a transversal, so last week it looked something like this. There's my two lines and then my transversal T. So this lesson we're looking at essentially the same situation, only the two lines have to be parallel. So we're considering, well, what happens if those two lines now, rather than just being two lines that intersect, if those two lines happen to be parallel, there's more information that we know. So here's my first picture. These two lines are parallel lines. They're marked by these arrows, and those arrows tell us that these lines will never intersect. So those little red arrows that I just drew in are going to tell us that they'll never intersect. And then here's my transversal. So the same scenario as what we saw in the last video. However, the unique add-in is that these two lines are parallel. And what it tells us is if these lines are parallel, then corresponding angles will be congruent. So one angle, for example, if I have angle 1, that would correspond to angle 5. So angle 1 will be congruent to angle 5. And the way we would write this as an explanation in if-then form is if parallel lines, then corresponding angles congruent. We can abbreviate corresponding as CORR. So anytime the lines are parallel, then corresponding angles must be congruent. Okay, let's consider alternate interior angles. I have one line, and then I have another line parallel to that. Those two are marked as being parallel. Here's my transversal. So what do we know about alternate interior angles? Well, here's one particular pair of alternate interior angles, 2 and 6. Well, what we know, if the lines are parallel at least, if those lines are parallel, then we know that alternate interior angles will be congruent. And the if-then form of that would be if parallel lines, then alternate interior angles are congruent. Alternate exterior angles. So once again, we have our parallel lines. In this case, they're running vertically. And our transversal is here. So one particular pair of alternate exterior angles would be, for example, 4 and 7. Well, if those lines are parallel, as they're shown here by the marking, since those are parallel, we know angle 4 is congruent to angle 7. So again, our if-then statement would be, if parallel lines, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. Okay, the last relationship we have is consecutive interior angles. I call those same side interior angles. So we have two lines which happen to be parallel, intersected by a transversal. And for example, we might have 9 and 10 as our consecutive interior angles. Now, this is the one unique angle relationship that will not be congruent if the lines are parallel. In this case, these are actually different measures. They're supplementary. The only time that they'll be congruent is if they're supplementary and congruent, then they would be 90 degrees. But that's a one unique situation. So we don't know that consecutive interior angles are congruent. We do, however, know that they're supplementary. So if parallel lines, then consecutive interior angles are supplementary. Now, if we look at this, we have 4 different angle relationships. We have the 3 occurring on the left. We have the corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, and alternate exterior angles. And they all have the same relationship when the lines are parallel. So if the lines are parallel, these are going to be congruent. Okay? But consecutive interior angles, on the other hand, they're not going to be congruent when the lines are parallel. They are going to be supplementary, which means they add to be 180 degrees. So be aware that 3 of these angle relationships are going to have a congruent relationship, but this consecutive interior angles will be a supplementary relationship when the lines are parallel, not congruent, except for that one unique situation, which does not happen that often. All right, let's take a look at an example. Example 1 says to identify congruent angles. The measure of 3 of the numbered angles is 125 degrees. Identify those angles and explain why they have a measure of 125 degrees. Okay, so here's our picture. We have these 2 lines, and they're told to be parallel. And then we have a transversal. Our numbered angles are 1, 2, 4. We have a 125 degree angle here. And then we have these numbered angles as well. So it tells us that 3 other angles are 125 degrees. We need to tell what those angles are and give a reason why. And keep in mind our reason should be an if-then form. So the first angle that I'm going to think about as being congruent to 125 is angle 1. Now, I want you to stop and think about what type of relationship we called this last week. It's nothing new. This is a review problem. Hopefully you're thinking vertical angles, and that would be exactly true. So angle 1 is also equal to 125 degrees, and our reason for that is if 2 angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Keep in mind the if is just using the keyword that was provided to us or that we noticed occurring in the picture, and the then is the conclusion we can make. All right, so looking at this now, there's no old information that we can use to show other congruent angles, but we can use a new relationship. This original angle of 125 degrees is going to correspond to angle 7. So angle 7 is also going to be 125 degrees. And our reason is that they're corresponding angles. So if 2 angles, I apologize, we're going to start that differently. If the lines are parallel, then corresponding angles are congruent. So our if for the new relationships that we're seeing today is going to describe the lines as being parallel. So if we weren't given that these 2 lines are parallel, that would not be a statement we could make. Let's continue on. Now we can say that there's another angle pair that we can observe, and that's angles 5 and 7. Once again, angle 5 is going to be equal to 125 degrees due to vertical angles. So if 2 angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Now, I also could have approached this in a different way. I also could have said that since this original 125 degree angle and angle 5 are alternate interior angles, then I could have stated if parallel lines, then alternate interior angles are congruent. So that would have been a good way to describe that as well. Example 2 says use properties of parallel lines. Find the value of x, then find the measure of angle 2. Explain your work. Okay, so if we want to find x, what we need to first consider is what different relationships do we have going on here. Well, there's a couple of different things going on. So if I first focus on this 113-degree angle, I want to think about how it relates to 3x minus 4. The first thing I need to do is classify those angle types. So are they consecutive interior, alternate exterior, corresponding, and so forth? Well, since these are on different sides of this particular transversal, they're alternating, and they're both exterior angles. So this 113-degree angle and the 3x minus 4 are going to be alternate exterior angles. Now, one thing that they did not tell us is that these lines are parallel. So I'd like you to add in that line L and line K are parallel. So note, line L is parallel to line K. Without that piece of information, we would not be able to do this problem. So since we know that those lines are parallel, we know the alternate exterior angles are congruent. So congruent means the same measure. So we're going to use an equal sign in our equation to replace that congruent sign. So 113 equals 3x minus 4. Our reason for that, if parallel lines, then you're going to describe what kind of angles those are. So are they corresponding, alternate exterior, alternate interior, and so forth? Well, these happen to be alternate exterior angles. So then alternate exterior angles, and then you're going to say what they are. Are they supplementary, complementary, or congruent? Well, alternate exterior angles, if you look back on the front page, we said when the lines are parallel, will be congruent. So we'll say if parallel lines, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. So we already made our equation. Let's go ahead and solve that. We're going to isolate the variable term by adding 4. So 117 is equal to 3x. When we divide by 3, we're going to find that x is equal to 39. So it said find the value of x. We did that. Then find the measure of angle 2. Well, if we look at this piece of information, we already said that this particular angle was the same as 113 degrees. So we know if we were to input x into this equation, 3 times 39 minus 4 would be 113 degrees. We need to find angle 2. So now we need to consider what is true about this angle and this angle. Well, they're not congruent, but they are a linear pair. So angle 2 will add with the 113 degree angle to make 180 degrees. So again, that's review from a couple of videos ago. So now we can solve that and find that angle 2 is 67 degrees since they're a linear pair. It said to explain your work. Well, we've already explained how we used this equation. We have not yet explained how we found angle 2. So what we're going to do is start with our if-then statement. So if, well, we use the fact that those two angles were a linear pair. So if two angles are a linear pair, then we need to state the conclusion we can make. Then they are supplementary. And that's our justification. I know at this point it might still be difficult to put your reasoning into if-then statements, but just continue to practice it and you'll get stronger at it each time. All right, go ahead and try the you try nows. Pay close attention to the answers so that you can check that you've done that correctly. And pay close attention to the wording in the problems and explain what you did or how you did your work. Have a good day, and I'll see you soon.